Melody runs our field trips, which we have one coming up on November 16th to Sucker Creek. And we actually dig, you don't have to dig. You basically walk around, pick up rocks and look at them. And there's leaf fossils there, so they're quite abundant. Rarely do any kids go home without something in their pockets. So that's a really fun thing to do. The other thing is we have books on the table, and they're by donation. If we'd rather put them in your hands and you walk out the door and we never see anything from them, than for them to go home and sit in our storage for 6 months till we start up again. So, but also it's two different groups. There was a group that you guys didn't hear. We had a speaker, Dave Bisbee, last month, and he basically told us to put the books up. If people want them, fine. If you want to donate to his website or to us, and we'll send it to them. Either way, that will work out. The second thing, we've got to now have a website up and running, which is really nice. It's foundationsingenesis.org, all one word, no spaces. And then if you like our speaker, Bryce, you can hear him again. He'll be at 2:30 at Grace Bible on 4262 North Meridian, and there's a bulletin back there in case you can't remember numbers like I can't. And with that, today our speaker is Bryce Robinson, graduated from International Bible Institute and worked underneath Joe Taylor, paleontologist out of Texas. He is in the process of writing a book with Stan Letts on the creation topic sciences. He has volunteered with the Creation Science Ministry, Blanca Fossil Ministry, and Creation Evidence Ministry. So ministry, so the last one was actually museum. So with that, he's got some good credentials, and he's way too smart and better looking than I am, so I'm sure you'd rather have him talking than me. So with that, I'll give you Bryce.
Just turn my projector on over here. Anything coming out? Well, it's good to be here with all of you this morning. This is one of my favorite talks to give because it's just so, really for the pictures more than anything, because God has made all of these amazing structures. When we look up at the skies, we see all these, there's just supernova and nebula and the stars themselves and galaxies, and it's so glorious when you look at it. It's one of the most glorious things that God has made. And that really is the premise this morning, is giving glory to God for what he has made. Genesis 1:16 says, "And God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night." And then this is one of my favorite little, he just kind of tacks this on to the end of the sentence. He made the stars also. It was like, oh yes, and I did that as well. I did that too. All those millions of billions of stars you see up in the heavens, I made that too. Like I say, it's possibly the biggest understatement in the Bible. But there were people in history who didn't give glory to God for the stars. When they looked up at the stars, instead of worshiping the God who made the stars, they would worship the stars themselves. They would take those stars and either make gods of them or say that the stars had control over events in their lives, things of that nature. And so they would actually worship the stars. And in Amos 5:25, God sort of rebukes Israel for this. He says, "Did you bring me sacrifices and offerings during the 40 years in the wilderness, O house of Israel? You shall take up Sikkoth your king and Kiyun your star god, your images that you have made for yourselves." So they, instead of glorifying God, they would glorify these stars. And of course, we glorify the one who made the stars, not just not just because the stars are glorious, because it really took incredible power. It took incredible wisdom. It took incredible knowledge to make these things that we see. And I'll explain a little bit of that today. I'll sort of briefly touch on the topics. I can pretty easily get too technical. I had to take a lot out of this lecture because when you start studying the stars, there are so many minute details that have to be right for these things to be balanced in their orbits and such. But you know, people looking up to the stars and not giving glory to God, it wasn't just an ancient thing. This wasn't just something that the ancients did. People will also do that today. They'll look up to the stars, and instead of giving glory to God as they should, they give glory to maybe the natural processes or the things themselves. They claim that everything we see is just maybe part of these big cycles or part of these things that work over long ages. And these naturalistic philosophers in lab coats, because they really do pretend to be scientists, but they're actually philosophers, I want to show you today that they don't actually know a lot of the things that they're claiming to know. They're selling you things as if they were true, when in fact these things are more speculation than fact. They call these things science, but falsely. And one of the ways they do this is they say that, you know, we can clearly see, they might say, how each and everything evolved to its present form from simple nothing. How nothing evolved into space and energy, nothing exploded. It exploded into space and energy. That space and energy formed itself into matter, it condensed into matter, and then those particles of matter, they gradually came together via gravity and other processes. And over long periods of time, this created everything that we see. From the biggest galaxies down to the smallest particles. Everything can be explained through time, chance, and natural law. These are the three false gods that the naturalists worship. Time, chance, and natural law. And instead of giving glory to God, they give glory to these three as if they are gods. They say that time, chance, and natural law they have all power. If you just make them big enough, if it just lasts long enough, then everything will naturally form into everything that we see around us. Well, I'm here today to show that this isn't true. The things we see should not be used to glorify these false gods, because no matter how much time you have, no matter how many chances you take, no matter how much natural law you might think you know, these are never sufficient to explain what we see. One of the ways that these philosophers in lab coats, they try to diminish God's glory is by removing our trust in God's word. Because if we don't believe God's word, if we don't believe, let's just say, the first chapter, why should we believe the rest of it? And why should we give him glory for creation if we don't believe that he did indeed create anything? So one of the ways that they do this is by saying that one of the core scientific claims of the Bible, the claim that the earth is less than 10,000 years old, they try to say that this claim is wrong. And as an example of a counterclaim they might make to try to discredit God's word, one of their counterclaims goes something like this. The stars are millions of light years away. If the earth is only 10,000 years old, we shouldn't be able to see these stars that are so many millions of light years away, because the light would still be traveling to us. That's an argument that they make. Well, there's three reasons I'd like to bring to your attention today. There's actually more than these three, but we'll stick with these three for the sake of time. There are three reasons why this claim should not trouble those of us who believe in a much younger earth. I don't think 10,000 years is young by any measure, except by maybe comparing it to these ridiculously long ages that they put forward. But in any case, they call us young earth creationists. So why should we who believe in a young earth not be troubled by this? Well, For one thing, a light year is a measure of distance, not time. If God can make a tree that appears to be 10 years old, and it's really just a few days or a few hours or a few seconds old, if God can make Adam a fully grown male who's capable of walking and talking and getting married all on the very same day he was made, God can also make these stars and starlight that would have come from them as if they were shining through these millions of light years instantly. God can make everything fully formed, and it would appear older than it actually is. The second reason you shouldn't be troubled by this is that this problem of distant starlight, it's not as huge of a problem as the other problem that God had, because it says in Jeremiah 51:15, He made the earth by His power, He founded the world by His wisdom, and listen to this, He stretched out the heavens by His understanding. And I think there's a good case to be made from this verse and other verses like it, that God created everything, He created everything sort of at one point. And then He pulled space itself apart into its current size and shape. So we've only recently discovered that time and space itself can actually bend. It bends in these weird four-dimensional ways, including the three dimensions that we're used to, and then, of course, time. And if Einstein's correct, and there's a lot of evidence that he is, this stretching, it would have been a stretching out of not only space, but also time, because they're related. So when God stretched out the heavens, He's stretching out space, and He's stretching out time. And so just because the earth is only 6,000 to 10,000 years old doesn't necessarily mean that the rest of the universe is that exact same age. It could be quite a bit older, it could be quite a bit younger because of this stretching process. So that's the second reason you shouldn't be concerned with the problem of distant starlight, as they say. The third reason is that we don't actually know how far the stars are away from us. We have some guesses. We're pretty sure that they're at least several light years away. And a light year is it's trillions and trillions of miles. This is a very gigantic unit of measurement. So we're pretty sure the stars are at least light years away, but we can't really accurately measure distance in space. And the reason for this is that most of their methods rely on one method, which is known as parallax. And parallax is sort of a trigonomic function where you take the sides of an angle and the angles of an angle. If you've got one side and two angles, you can deduce the distance to something. However, for their reference point, they need a fixed background. They need to know the distance to something that is very, very far out. But what they're trying to determine is how far away something is. So in order to determine how far something is, you need to know how far that something is. So it's sort of this loop, this logical loop where they say, well, how far is that? It's very, very far away. It's so far away we can use it as a background. How do you know that? Well, we would have to use these same methods to measure the background as we do the foreground. If their measurements were off, the angles they're dealing with are so incredibly tiny. If they were off by 1/3000th of 1 degree, the star they're measuring could be 1 billion light years closer or 1 billion light years further. That's how tiny these angles are that they're playing with. So those are the reasons you shouldn't really worry about the distant starlight problem. God could have made them fully formed. God stretched out the heavens, and they can't really accurately measure space itself. It's very, very difficult to get a good reading on anything past about 1 light year, maybe. They might be able to measure 5 to 10 light years, perhaps. I might give them that. But everything past that is very, very debatable. But there's some problems with their theories. There's some questions you should ask of the people who would deny God His glory for making everything. Spiral galaxies. Why do these things exist? there's what we call the winding problem. So if you're familiar with orbital mechanics, and there's no reason you should be, the outer orbits are slower than the inner orbits. So the inner orbits have to go faster. If you're orbiting something, the inner orbit has to be faster than the outer orbit to be stable. And so these spiral galaxies present a very real problem, because after just a few rotations, a few revolutions, it would change from a spiral galaxy into a disk galaxy. You would no longer have these intricate spiral patterns that are so clear and so beautiful. Yet, a vast number of the galaxies we see are a spiral galaxy or some form of a spiral galaxy. But these shouldn't exist if these galaxies are very old, if these rotations have been going on for very long. And for pretty much every problem, that they always have these solutions, but when you look at the solution that they're proposing, it's sort of like trying to bail out the Titanic with a thimble. The solutions they propose, the effects do not match the causes. Their causes are far, far too small to get the effects that they're hoping they can get. Another problem for them: why do galaxies exist at all? These vast structures in space, we've got all these stars together, and they're in these very intricate structures that have a very definite shape. But according to their model, the best model for the formation of the universe that the evolutionists have proposed is the Big Bang model. And the Big Bang model is where you have this original singularity that contains space and time and matter, and everything is in this little point. And this little point explodes at some point in the past. It explodes for no reason at all. This nothing point explodes, and from that you get matter. Well, the problem with that model is, unless they do some really disingenuous mathematical tricks, that explosion will result in a very, very uniform cloud of gas that's expanding out. And that cloud of gas will be basically perfectly mixed, perfectly balanced in every direction. And so you'll never have stars form, you'll never have galaxies form, you'll never have anything except for this pretty much infinitely expanding cloud of hydrogen. That's all that you should have according to the Big Bang model. Yet when we look up at the sky, that's clearly not the case. The galaxies are spinning too fast. When they measure the distances in the galaxies, and they think they can measure those, I think they can't, but they measure the distances, they measure the rate of rotation, and then they try to calculate how much gravity would be needed to hold that galaxy together. Well, when they do those calculations, there's far too little mass, and it's spinning far too fast. So these galaxies would actually explode over not very long if the mass that we see is all that's there. So they turn to dark matter. They've estimated that the universe might be up to 97% dark matter. If your theory only matches reality to 3%, maybe you should revise your theory instead of saying that there's this invisible force holding everything together. Don't you think? Let's just say, for example, you have a teacher and she gives you a question, a test. Well, if you come up with an answer that's 3% right, is she going to accept that? Is she going to accept an answer that's 3% right? No, she wouldn't. And we shouldn't either. This is science fiction. How do stars form? Because not only are spiral galaxies a problem, not only are galaxies themselves a problem, stars are also a problem for their theory. Because we see a star blow up about every 25 to 30 years. It's a pretty predictable process that you can kind of go back in history and see all the different times when they've blown up, because they usually go off in a supernova and they light up for a moment in the sky. So we know they blow up every 25 to 30 years, but we never see them form. And the trick they pull is, well, they form in these very dense clouds of gas. You see these nebula. And behind the curtain, there is a star being made. Trust us, we know. It's a sure thing that there's a star behind this curtain. And then every once in a while, some gas will move out of the way and a star will be revealed, and they'll say, see, a star has formed. You just saw it. But we didn't see it. We just saw a spot get either slightly brighter or some gas move out of the way. It's sort of like, I don't know if you've seen any of the Three Stooges, but they'll be in their workshop and you'll hear all these noises. You'll hear like the hammering and the sawing, and then you go in there and it's just a tape. They're not actually doing anything. They're still asleep. The evolutionists do something very similar with star formation. But there's this problem of star formation also extends because there's this law, and it's called Boyle's gas law. And the principle is that a gas that has any sort of temperature will continue to expand if it's not confined by something. So it will expand nearly infinitely to fill any volume that it's inside of. It always pushes itself apart. It has this repulsive force between the atoms or the molecules or whatever the gas is made of. So because of this law, the force of gravity would not be enough to overcome these counter forces that are pushing the gas apart. And we've known this since 1662. I mean, this isn't exactly cutting-edge research. Globular clusters. These are a very real problem for evolutionists and the theory of evolution, these naturalistic philosophers in lab coats. How is it possible for these to exist? Because a globular cluster is this amazing structure you find out in space where you've got thousands or millions of stars all in sort of a ball shape. They're not in a disk like you would typically see in a galaxy. They're actually in these ball shapes. And to maintain stability, well, first let me explain one of the problems that these globular clusters have. If you have two bodies, let's just say the Earth and the Moon, and they're orbiting each other, these two bodies can be described via Newton's math in a very, very, they can be described very accurately. You know when one is going to rotate the other, the exact period, the speed needed, all of the different variables can be accounted for, and you can predict precisely what will happen to those two bodies. However, if you add a third body at approximately the same distance to the other two, if you have basically an equidistant spacing or just slightly isometric, but anyway, if you have three bodies, if you introduce a third body into this system, it destabilizes it. So these two original bodies, let's just say the Earth and the Moon, if we were to put another moon just slightly further out beyond the lunar orbit we have, the Earth and the Moon and that third body would all exchange energy in these weird ways, and usually what happens is one of the bodies is ejected. It's what's known as this three-body problem. So these three bodies, they exchange energy in these weird chaotic ways, and then one of them is thrown out. That's usually what happens when you have more than two things that are exchanging very much gravity. But these globular clusters, they're incredible because they're either expanding at such a rate as they're never going to contract under gravity, or they're falling in towards the center, or God has balanced them so very well that they're doing this incredibly intricate dance of stars to maintain these globular clusters' stability. And any three of these either couldn't last very long or would be so incredibly unlikely you would have to have someone of godlike intelligence to make it work. So pretty much every structure that we see out there poses some huge problem for the evolutionists, the naturalistic philosophers who would deny God his glory. It poses some sort of problem for them. And again, God is just, he makes these incredibly beautiful, incredibly intricate patterns inside of these galaxies. And I would encourage you to look up the James Webb Telescope and the Hubble Telescope. That's where I got a lot of these pictures. They're just incredible. And a lot of these are extrasolar structures. They're outside of our solar system. But I'd like to turn to the things that are inside of our solar system. Because over the last 60 years, we've sent probes to a lot of places within the solar system. Everything outside the solar system, pretty much, we have to rely exclusively on data from telescopes and radioscopes and things that detect photons. Typically, we receive very little, maybe a couple of particles, but we receive very little from outside the solar system. But from inside the solar system, we can actually send probes to these things, and we have been for several decades now. We've been sending probes to the outer planets, we've been sending probes to the inner planets, and we've been gathering this very, very good data. And so this data has been stumping some of their theories. It's been presenting some very real problems for those who say that all of this was just created by these false gods of time, chance, and natural law. These are an example of some of the probes I was mentioning. Jupiter. This is Jupiter if you're looking at it through the infrared spectrum, and it's a false color image, I believe. But Jupiter has this problem for their formation theories called the fuzzy core problem. What's the fuzzy core problem? Well, basically, when the evolutionists came up with their models of how the solar system was evolving, they posit that there's this cloud of gas and dust that's rotating around the central star, this protostar that's forming. And as this cloud of gas and dust is rotating, there's these rocks that form out of it, and out of those rocks, you have the rocks congregate together because of gravity, and they form themselves into these rocky planets. And the rocky planets go around a few times, and they suck up gas, and they suck up enough gas to form themselves into gas giants eventually. And that was the theory, and it doesn't work, and we'll go over why it doesn't work here in a little bit. But even if it did work, they have this fuzzy core problem. And the fuzzy core problem is they were expecting to find a rocky planet, essentially, this very dense, very distinct rocky core in the middle of Jupiter. Well, when they flew the probe, I believe it was the probe Juno, by this planet, they were able to measure the gravity basically by how much the probe was deflected as it flew along in certain orbital paths. They could feel the gravity, you might say. And so as they felt this gravity, it wasn't correct to match their models. Jupiter has a very evenly distributed, the elements inside of Jupiter are very evenly distributed. Instead of all settling out into this rocky core as they would over millions of years, instead, they're very evenly distributed. And this is a very real problem because all of their models say that this should not be the case. There's also this problem that gas giants exist at all, because in their theories of how the solar system formed, I already described that briefly. You've got this rocky planet kind of going around this gas cloud, sucking up gas. But as it does this, it's going to be losing kinetic energy. So as it's sucking up this gas and dust, it's going to be losing kinetic energy, and it's going to fall to a lower orbit. And in all of their models, it sucks up more and more gas, it falls to a lower and lower orbit, and eventually it falls into the sun. And it does this long before it has enough time to create itself, to build itself up to the sizes that we see in our outer gas giants. So the very existence of gas giants is a problem for their naturalistic philosophies. And I'd like to show you, if I can, if y'all can see this, a little simulation of the solar system you can go to at, I believe this is Eyes on the Solar System. This is a program that NASA made, I believe, and it sort of shows you the different orbits of the planets. You've got Jupiter and Saturn and Uranus. But notice how they're all sort of on this flat plane. they're very close. I believe they're all within 7 degrees of what they call the plane of the ecliptic. That's the plane where everything rotates. And what's really interesting about this is that the nebula formation theory was built specifically to describe why this is the case. Because this doesn't have to be the case. If you look at like the dwarf planets, they actually fly in these very weird sort of far out orbits that are not on the plane of the ecliptic. They're what you would expect if things were captured randomly. But instead, we get these nice, very circular, very flat orbits, and those are a problem for their formation theories, and so they came up with this idea of the nebula theory. But the nebula theory has the problem that planets like Uranus have their own system of moons around them. So if you'll notice, planet Uranus sort of spins on its side compared to the plane of the ecliptic, but it has its own moons. It has Ariel and Miranda and Umbriel and Titania and Oberon, and these all orbit on their own plane, but that plane is different from the plane that the planets rotate in. So it's sideways. It shouldn't be like that. If everything formed out of this spinning cloud of gas and dust, it should all be flat. It should all be on the same plane instead of being flipped on its side. And this presents a very real problem for them. Also, the planet Venus. We just fly over to Venus. Let's see if we can get it. The planet Venus actually spins backwards. So it rotates backwards very, very slowly. Venus it's not very visually interesting because it's mostly clouds. You can't really see through its cloud cover. But Venus actually rotates. It doesn't orbit, but it rotates backwards. And so this presents a problem for their theories because if everything condensed out of this spinning cloud of gas, everything should also rotate in the same direction. But it doesn't. So they posit that something hit it and started it spinning backwards. But then you have a different problem because Venus has one of the most circular orbits of any object in the solar system. It has a very, very perfectly circular orbit. It's just amazing when I look at it because the period of a planet, let me just get this spinning because you can actually see some really cool. Just focus this on the Earth. This is 6 days every second. See how the moon operates in this nice circular orbit? We'll come back to that in a second. But these systems are very difficult to create when you have a circular orbit because the period of the orbit is related to the speed. And so the speed and the distance from the sun, basically the vector has to be just right to get these nice circular orbits that we see all over the solar system. And that's one of the things that impresses me about this system that God has made. Let's see here. Exit out of that for now. Come back to... Here's the moons of Uranus I was talking about a moment ago. Oh yeah, the other gas giants also have the same problem. They each have their own system of moons, and these moons are not on the plane of the ecliptic as they should be. Uranus is the worst, but the other planets also have this problem. But the rings of Saturn are also a problem for them, because very recently, if you'll notice, do you see this gap right there in between the planet and the rings? There's that little gap where there's not a ring. So in that ring, they actually recently flew a probe through that gap, and they were able to measure the rate at which the rings are falling down into the planet, because the rings are actually raining down onto Saturn. Well, when they measured this ring rain, They calculated that it was falling down at a rate of 22,000 pounds or 10,000 kilograms of material every single second. And if this is correct, then by my little back of the envelope calculations, the rings would be completely gone in about 21 million years, 21 and a half. Very, very soon, according to their models. These rings are not old, they're a recent structure. This is one of the coolest pictures, I think, I've ever seen, because you cannot get this picture from the inner solar system. You have to be outside the orbit of Saturn to see it from the back, to see it lit up in this way, this very beautiful crescent formation. And it's just, I imagine if you were there, it would just be mind-bogglingly beautiful. Of course, it's slightly pixelated because they're sending these images over very long distances, but just amazing to me. This is Io, and it's one of Jupiter's moons. It's the most geologically active body in the entire solar system. There's always these volcanoes, these different sorts of geothermal processes that it's undergoing. And I guess I don't know if it would be geothermal because it's another planet, but there's all these different thermal processes that this planet is undergoing. And the problem with this is that it's far too hot to be very old, because planets undergo cooling just like anything else. If they're not receiving heat from the sun, and this is very far out in the solar system, so it's not receiving all that much heat, but it's outputting all this heat. And so how does it output all of this if it's billions of years old? I have a quote here, and it says, it's talking about Io, its unique surface sports a massive active volcano named Loki, whose lava output exceeds that of all Earth's volcanoes put together. Of course, where there's smoke, there's fire, and the origin of Io's volcanic heat remains a mystery. No long-age models have been able to match the measured heat output of this tiny fiery sphere. Specifically, Io emits 10 to the 14th watts of power, approximately equal to the output of 10 trillion light bulbs. Virtually all attempts to model Io's heat refer to its tidal friction. This occurs when Io is pulled in different directions by the gravitational attraction of Jupiter on one side and the planet's other moons on the other side. This causes flexing that generates heat beneath Io's crust, although not enough to account for this massive heat output. So, for a little bit of context, and here's a very beautiful picture one of the probes captured as it flew by. It captured a geyser actually going off, or a volcano actually going off. But for a little bit of context, all of humanity's total power generation is about 3 times 10 to the 12th. So Io is outputting continuously about 33 times the energy that the entire human race is generating to turn every motor, light every bulb, and power every single computer on Earth. I mean, that's a lot of power. They expect us to believe that it's been doing this for billions of years with no discernible mechanism. But their problems haven't ended. Let's see here. As I talked about a little bit earlier, they have a lot of problems with rotation, the rotation of various things. The rotation of Venus, the rotation of Uranus. These planets present real problems for them. These systems of moons that are around the planets. These all present a very real problem for them. But the sun itself presents a very real problem because it's spinning, but it's not spinning nearly fast enough. You see, if everything condensed out of this cloud of gas and dust, the angular momentum should remain the same. It should remain proportional to the mass. So the sun has about 99% of the mass in the solar system. It should have about 99% of the angular momentum in the solar system because of conservation of angular momentum. How much angular momentum do you think the sun actually has? Anyone want to throw a number out there, a wild guess? Rob, you cheated last time. You'd already heard this talk. Well, it's about 1 to 2%. So it's got 99% of the mass. It should have 99% of the angular momentum, but instead it only has about 1 or 2%. And this is a real problem for this hypothesis that everything condensed out of the nebula. The spin should be very different. The Earth should also be tidally locked to the moon. We'll talk about this a little bit more in the future. Comets. These also present a real problem because it's been recognized for a very long time that short and long period comets, they don't have enough mass to sustain the burn rate that we observe. So every time they go around the sun, a bit of their surface, actually a significant amount of their surface, is burned off or sublimated away. It turns straight from usually water or carbon dioxide ice into a gas, and then that gas flies off, and you see it as these very long, beautiful tails. But all that material that's leaving the comet is obviously leaving the comet. And so every time it comes around, it gets smaller. And eventually it gets small enough that it just breaks fragments and is destroyed. Well, if the solar system is millions of years old, how would there be any of these comets left? These comets should have all sublimated away. They should have burned away a long time ago. But they haven't. We still have these very beautiful, very fragile structures that keep coming by and keep diminishing year on year. They, of course, have a science fiction explanation for it. They say that there's this Oort cloud that we can't see, that's far outside, that's being disturbed by other bodies that we can't see, and it's replenishing these ice meteors continuously. But again, this is not based on observations. This is because they need to save their theories. It's a pretty common reoccurring theme. Anytime you present them with a problem that says, this can't be millions of years old, they'll say, well, it can be. We just haven't observed the things that we need for it yet. Let's see here. The magnetic fields of the planets. This is a picture of Mercury. And Mercury in particular should not have a magnetic field if it's millions of years old. And yet it does. Not only does it have a magnetic field, a gentleman by the name of Russell Humphrey, who's a creation physicist with a PhD, he was able to successfully predict the decline in the magnetic field of Mercury over the last 40 years. His theory fit the data very well. He was able to also successfully predict the strengths of both Uranus and Neptune. He took the creation story of the Bible and he thought about, how God made things out of water, and he was able from that to predict these magnetic field strengths even today. And I thought that was pretty amazing. These magnetic fields, they're a problem because, like I talked about with Io, if all of these planets are millions or billions of years old, they should have cooled down long ago. And so the mechanism for generating these magnetic fields should have been destroyed millions and millions of years ago. But they still have magnetic fields. Our own moon. The moon should not exist according to their theories. There is no theory they have been able to come up with that can explain the existence of our moon. It's too round, it spins too slow, it doesn't orbit on the Earth's equatorial, its orbit is too circular, and there are no naturalistic theories that explain it well. Sometimes they can explain 2 or 3 of those. They can never explain all of them. The moon is also moving away. So when we sent astronauts to the moon, we left these little reflectors up there. And these reflectors allow us to shoot a laser at the moon. It bounces back, and we can very accurately measure the distance to the moon year by year. Well, as they do this year by year, they notice that the moon is actually moving away from us. Its orbit is getting larger. And this is because of, as the Earth spins under the moon, the Earth is spinning faster than the moon is orbiting, obviously. It takes around, I think it's 28 days for the moon to go around us, but it takes obviously 1 day for the Earth to rotate entirely. So as the Earth rotates faster under the moon, it gives just a tiny bit of its energy to the moon, which causes the moon to speed up, and then its orbit gets just a little bit bigger, so it's moving away. The problem with this is if you go back in time, if you run this process in reverse, the moon gets closer. And so as the moon gets closer, you start to have worse and worse effects. First, you start having these high tides that start destroying your coastlines very, very quickly. Then you start having the tides actually get so high they swamp the Earth twice a day. And then just a little bit before that, the moon actually disintegrates because it's so close to the Earth, its gravity is not enough to hold it together. And that happens, I think they say, about 1.5 billion years ago. If you ran its orbit back that long, the moon would be destroyed. So I want to just show you sort of a slideshow to finish. I have a conclusion, but I want to just run this slideshow in the background. You know, our solar system and our universe, it's just full of amazing engineering. It's full of these structures that would be so difficult to create. I didn't even get to those systems of moons are all stabilized in these very advanced ways. They have these resonances and the spins and these very circular orbits. All of these things they promote stability so that these structures don't fly apart. And to credit these things to the false gods of time and chance and natural law is just, it's so disingenuous to our God, who should get the glory for these things, who should get the glory for all these wonderful structures he's made that we can look out with our telescopes, that we can send our probes to and see. We should glorify God for what he has made. And I know it's cliche, and you probably hear the same verse every single talk, but it really is true. Psalm 19:1. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. They have no speech, they use no words, no sound is heard from them. Yet their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world. We should look to God, we should look to the heavens, we should hear their silent voices and give God the glory. I believe we have enough time for questions if anyone has anything that came up during the talk that they thought of, or just anything in general. Yes. Uh-huh. I don't know if that's necessarily why the gap exists. There's material crossing that gap, coming from the rings, falling into the planet. It might, the rings might also just get thinner, because, I mean, they're very thin from the front edge, they're very thin that direction, but what I meant by thinner is less material in them. There's different bands, and that picture shows the different bands. There's C ring, B ring, and A ring, and F ring, and there's actually a D ring that it doesn't show, and that D ring is what's falling away. But the rings themselves are a very finely balanced structure they're getting dirtier over time, and they're also mixing more over time. Because when you look at a very close-up picture of these rings, they have very nice, clean, divided lines. And over time, those are growing less definite. That's sort of diffusing into each other. Yes. Uh-huh. Yes, I am. Those moons are very, very difficult to balance. And I was describing, I had a part of the talk that I didn't get into, but the inner three of Jupiter's Galilean satellites are actually in resonance with one another. So they're in a 1-2-4 resonance. So every time one of them goes around once and then twice, the other one has gone around once. And then every time the first one goes around 4 times, the third one has gone around once. And so they meet up. There was an interesting animation that showed with ticks. You could hear the ticks when they went by each other, and it sounded like this little harmony. You know, it'd go tick, 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 tick. It had this very definite pattern that was very cool. But I think, as I was talking about the spin also, when I was reading about this, I'm pretty sure the spin of Jupiter that it's exchanging energy with those moons, so their orbit is actually widening slightly every year. And I'm pretty sure that's something God has set up so that they don't get these weird little chaotic disturbances that are amplified and then destroy the system. So Jupiter's actually sort of pulling them along, keeping them from, like I say, getting these weird little amplified chaotic noise, basically. Yes, and actually they're going to capture, apparently God made it where they're going to capture the fourth moon into a 1-2-4-8 resonance. And it's not there yet, but probably, I don't know how long they estimate, but probably in a few thousand years it would capture that last moon into this resonance as well. Anyone else? Any more questions? Well, thank you all for y'all's time and attention this morning. It's been good to get to show you some pictures of stars.